Welcome to the Canadian Constitution Foundation's Freedom Update. I'm Christine, the CCF's litigation director, and today we are joined by author and journalist Andrew Lawton, who's also a friend of mine. I've known Andrew for quite a long time, so it's great to see you in this context, Andrew. And Andrew has written a new book, The Freedom Convoy, the inside story of 3 weeks that shook the world. We're actually giving away a copy of Andrew's book at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. You'll get a new copy. Mine is a little dog-eared because seriously, it's an amazing book. It is so great. If you're interested in winning a copy, you can sign up at the ccf.ca/book contest. You just have to sign up. We're going to have a draw on September 6th to see who wins this copy. So in the book, Andrew combines his on-the-ground reporting with hours of interviews with convoy demonstrators to tell the full story of what happened from start to finish, including the background of the convoy, all the interesting personalities who were involved, and it provides real insight into how over the top the government's response of using the Emergencies Act was. You know, everyone has their own opinion about the Freedom Convoy. I have my own opinion as well. And some people might have found the convoy to have parts of it that were objectionable. But what's important to remember is that the government's response was so much worse. And this book gives such an incredible perspective about why. So we're calling this episode The Real Story About the Freedom Convoy, the true story of the Freedom Convoy, because there has been really one-sided and sometimes inaccurate reporting about what actually happened on the ground at the Freedom Convoy by a lot of media outlets. And Andrew was there speaking to people who were involved, and he gives a totally different perspective, and I think a really accurate perspective of what really happened. So, Andrew, thank you so much for joining today. Let's start from the beginning. I think what a lot of people don't know is about the origins of the Freedom Convoy, how it started and sort of why it started, because there's a lot more to it than just, what happened in Ottawa. It actually grew over time. So why don't you tell us that story?
It did. And I mean, if I really wanted to give you a long answer, I think I'd have to go back to March 2020, when I think a lot of the people who got involved in the convoy really started to become increasingly frustrated at various points and on various timelines with government actions, lockdowns, restrictions, vaccine mandates. But I think the one thing that's important to note about the origins of the convoy is that it was really the convergence of a lot of people that were really at their wits' end, and people that, for whatever reason, had decided that enough is enough. And the one I think most important thread there is a woman by the name of Bridget Belton, not one of the most prominent members of the convoy leadership, but she's a cross-border trucker from southwestern Ontario, unvaccinated by her own admission. And she had been, as an essential worker, going back and forth across the Canada-US border for the entirety of the pandemic without issue. And then at one point, she was just absolutely berated at a border crossing. I think it was Windsor. And she was berated for not wearing a mask while sitting in her own truck alone, talking to the CBSA agent who was in a wicket, presumably wearing a mask herself. And after 2 years of vaccine, or not 2 years of vaccine passports, but 2 years of restrictions, intermittent lockdowns, vaccine mandates, Bridget was just at her wit's end completely. And it was really, I think, the culmination of that she described was a really disruptive experience for her. And she started to feel like, okay, I've got to do something about this. And she connected to another cross-border trucker by the name of Chris Barber, and they were actually on TikTok, and they were messaging each other and planning this idea. And then it started to gain steam, and other people said, yeah, I want to be a part of this. And then the convoy as we know it really came to be.
When you talk about the leadership, I think that that's one of the things that was really confusing for observers who were not there on the ground participating in the convoy, or people who were just kind of observing through media reporting, because there was a lot of it seemed like confusion around who was leading this movement. And the reality that becomes clear in your book is that this was really a grassroots and organic type of protest without a clear hierarchy. So what can you tell us about the different people who claimed a leadership role or who stepped in to volunteer in some way and then ended up in an organizing role. And about the hierarchy or lack thereof. What is important to know about that and why it matters?
Well, it's a tricky question because there are inherent contradictions. I mean, a lot of the people involved in this movement actually did come together and formed a not-for-profit
Mhm.
corporation, which they called Freedom Corp. And this was the institution or the entity that was meant to handle the money. So in that sense, there was a structure and an organization and a hierarchy. There was a president and there was a board. But when you looked at the protest itself, there were leaders who had influence and leaders who had a level of trust and respect, but no one was working for anyone else. No one was being paid for being there. So if Tamara Leach, for an example, were to come out and say to a group of truckers, hey, I think you should move from this street to the other, she might be able to convince them to do it, but she has no leverage over them to make them do it. So she was a leader in the sense that people trusted her and respected her, but she wasn't in charge and couldn't make anyone do anything they didn't want to do. And the same was true of the people that were running the fuel distribution. The same is true of the people that were taking on roles to help with logistics, like Tom Marazzo, who I interviewed for the book, a former Army captain who really understood logistics quite well. And I think that was the big challenge here, is that an organizer was something of a Rorschach, whereas if the media wanted to string you up and sink you, they'd say, well, you're an organizer and you said this and therefore the movement is bad. And a lot of those people, like Pat King, for example, didn't really have legitimacy to the truckers, whereas people like Tamara Leach and Chris Barber and Tom Marazzo did. And that's why it's tricky. So there were certainly leaders and there were organizers, but it's very easy to overstate how much direct authority they had over people.
And what do you think of the general characterization in sort of the mainstream media, as I'd call it, of, this person was the convoy leader? Often it's described as Pat King, who, as you say, had a lot of reprehensible views, but he was not a figure of authority for a lot of the truckers.
This is where I get to do the thing that like authors I've interviewed over the years always do, which is tell people this is where you have to buy the book, because I try to give a fairly accurate and fair view of Pat King. And I try to deal with comments he's made head on. And I do considerably deal with his role in the convoy. And one of the things that I had learned when I was writing the book and interviewing people is that there were a couple of very clear moments where people involved, notably Tamara Leach, told him to go home. And very early on, I think they were at a truck stop. I can't remember if it was Regina or something like that. And they hadn't even gotten to Ottawa. And they were saying, Pat, you got to pack up and leave.
Mhm.
And he wouldn't do it. He actually just carried on to Ottawa doing his own thing. There were statements from Tamara Leach and Benjamin Dichter, who were the most vocal convoy spokespeople, that were disavowing him early on and continuously. And at a certain point, I think the media decided they just didn't want that. They didn't want to buy into that. They didn't want to believe it. And that's the challenge. And in a grassroots movement, whoever speaks the loudest tends to be one of the defining characters of it. And that was something that the convoy organizers really had to grapple with right through to the end.
One of the other things I thought was interesting about the mainstream coverage was at the beginning of the convoy, when it was first starting, there was a lot of commentary that this is a big nothing. There's nothing coming. Oh, you would even see people reporting from the highway saying, "Oh, I saw, 5 trucks. This is a big nothing. It's a lot of hype for nothing." And then obviously it turned out not to be true. How do you think that happened?
Well, I think there were certainly phases there. I mean, one of the early ones was just completely ignoring it. This was gaining
Mhm.
steam on TikTok and Twitter and Telegram and Facebook and word of mouth, and there was no media coverage of it until they were actually very close to this thing starting. And then when it did start gaining steam, you would see local news coverage in like smaller towns in Alberta and Saskatchewan that were seeing this, but for the most part, the mainstream media wasn't really paying close attention. I mean, one amusing episode that I remember is there was the same day that the trucks left British Columbia, there was this really, really tiny, unrelated protest involving trucks in British Columbia where they were protesting winter road conditions or something. And there
Yeah,
was
I
a
remember
CBC
that.
story about, trucks on the road protesting road conditions. And there were, like 8 trucks doing that and 80 trucks that were starting to make their way to Alberta for this. And it became something of a punchline in the convoy community that there was this much bigger protest that was just completely ignored. But I think it gained so much steam, it was impossible to ignore it. And that's when you saw the media's approach start shifting a little bit, and they started setting the stage for, oh, is this problematic? Are there racists? Are there white supremacists? Is there going to be violence? None of which materialized, but that was the narrative that was getting baked in early on.
Well, let's be clear. There were some people who were involved who had signs. I saw them, or flags, or, you know, I think there was a Confederate flag being waved at one of the protests. There was a really appalling anti-Semitic sign at one of the Toronto protests. So, you know, I don't think we should dismiss that happened as well. But I think the overall tenor was not that. Also, I think that large scale protests, I mean, this is just my opinion, tend to bring out a lot of people. There were thousands of people there, but let's not dismiss that. I don't know if you want to say anything about that part of it.
Yeah, I would caution against the word involved, because there were some of these incidents that I think really stand out. The Confederate flag is a fantastic example of this. There was at least one Confederate flag, and a guy who was covering his face fully in Ottawa, walking around with a Confederate flag, and this photo went very viral. Yeah. What didn't go as viral was a video of the same guy at the same moment being heckled out of the crowd as everyone around him said, "Get lost, no one wants you here." And curiously, that didn't get as much attention. There was, again, the photos of someone with a swastika flag, a Nazi flag, and to this day, no one has identified that person or interviewed them. We don't know if this is someone that was a Nazi, whether it was someone who was trying to make a really problematic charge that other people are Nazis, or was it someone trying to infiltrate and make them look bad? We don't know. Again, reprehensible to bring that image to a protest. Mm-hmm. But I think really, when you get down to it, one thing you said that I very much do agree with is that you're talking about thousands and thousands of people involved here. And the convoy organizers, the people in charge, were disavowing these symbols. And generally speaking, so were the people who were making up the bulk of the protest. So you're right. You can't say there was nothing in this that had that raised concerns, but it was, I think, very concerning to me how much these individual incidents were being elevated by critics of the convoy in a way that never happens in politically left-wing protests, from what I see.
I want to talk about another thing that there was a lot of focus on in these protests, which was this memorandum of understanding. So a lot was made of this. Yeah. It included some pretty weird stuff. But I think what I learned from your book was a lot of people involved in the protest had no idea about this memorandum of understanding. And it seemed to be latched onto by a lot of reporting, but the people who were participating didn't even know it. A lot of them didn't even know it existed. So what can you tell me about that?
Yeah, this was, again, I'd say this has actually been one of the criticisms that I'd say has probably been the most enduring by a lot of people that only sort of peripherally paid attention to it. So it's this document. I mean, you're the lawyer, so it would probably give you like an aneurysm to try to read this, because it's the most dangerous type of document, because it looks like it makes sense, and it looks like on the surface, it's citing this act and this step. Well, no, it's structured and formatted like it cites this act and this document and all of that, but it's complete nonsense. And it basically says, the Governor General and the Senate can enter into an agreement with the citizens of Canada to, do whatever. But this predated the convoy by many months, and it was the pet project of this one guy by the name of James Botter, who had a website, who very much so was involved in the convoy early on, because he went in there and said, yeah, I want to offer logistical support. Right now, you don't have a centralized website. I've got a website. Why don't I set up a page on my website with the routes? So that website where this convoy mapping and logistical information was also housing this other MOU. And James saw the convoy, by his own admission, as a conduit to promote this MOU, which he saw as being like a legal answer to lockdowns and restrictions and vaccine mandates and all of that. And people that were involved in the convoy, they were just hearing, hey, this guy's offering to help us with a website. We don't have a website. Okay, great. And it was only later on that a couple of them were getting questions about this thing, and they're like, what's that? Like, what's a MOU? Like, what is this thing? And James Botter had been disengaged from the convoy leadership before they even got to Ottawa for a number of reasons. And there's a bit of conflicting detail there about whether he walked away or they pushed him away, or if it was a combination. But The point is that the MOU had no legitimacy to the convoy, and by the time they got to Ottawa, the guy pushing the MOU was already out of the picture.
Okay, so let's talk about when they got to Ottawa. When they first arrived, what was the experience like? Were you there when they first arrived, and what was your experience reporting on that like?
So this is where I think it's important to stress the absolute chaos of this. So the plan was get to Ottawa on Saturday, and all these trucks are just going to start pouring into the city streets, and that was just complete chaos. There were different routes that had happened where trucks were broken up and they had to take different paths, and the arrival times were messed up, and there were weather delays in the north, and it just wasn't working that everyone could get there at the same time. Some of the Southern Ontario people came up on Friday. Other people that weren't even connected to organized convoys said, well, I want to get a good spot, so I'm going to get there early. So I had planned to be there Friday night so that on the official arrival Saturday, I would be able to kind of see this all come in and get situated. But by Friday, the whole downtown Ottawa was already an absolute sort of, I won't say the word, but an absolute just mass and amalgam of trucks on streets and people and cars and increasingly getting like that. So it was fascinating to me seeing there. And just remember, this was late January 2022. There are still vaccine passports in place in Ontario restaurants. There's still a mask mandate. Gathering limits, I believe, still existed to some extent by then. And the fascinating thing about all of this was that you'd walk into this little area I call convoy land in the book, for lack of a better term. And it was like walking back into 2019. There were no masks. People were just hanging out. And it was as though they were really trying to reclaim this world that had largely escaped them. And that was the feeling talking to them that people were really trying to capture and cultivate in that. But yeah, and the smell of diesel exhaust and the sound of horns is something, it was not the normal Ottawa that you or I are used to.
You mean there were people downtown after 4:30?
Yeah, although, I mean, the great line was even on like when thousands and thousands of people were there, someone took a picture of Spark Street and it was still empty, oddly. It's like, so nothing can get people onto Spark Street. That's the enduring lesson from the convoy, I think.
Hey, there's some good businesses on Spark Street. There's some places I used to like going, but when I lived there. So some of the most popular coverage that you had when you were reporting was actually just a straight up plain live stream that you were recording of the protests. You were recording and broadcasting it just as it happened. Why do you think that reporting was so impactful for people?
We talked earlier about the media narrative and the challenge there. And I think this was for people outside I don't want to say the Ottawa bubble, people outside of Ottawa that weren't seeing the convoy for themselves. This was, I think, one of the big themes of it, is that they really were starting to distrust the version of the events they were getting on news coverage, whether it was television, newspaper, radio. And people were seeing a little bit of a change here. They were looking on Instagram and seeing all of these folks coming to highway overpasses and waving their flags and cheering. And then they were seeing similar images from Ottawa of these people having pig roasts and singing and having karaoke night and all of this other stuff, the bouncy castles. And then they were on CBC panels looking at folks calling them white supremacists, insurrectionists, and all of that. So for me, when I was there, and I wasn't up there for the full 3 weeks, I was there for a few days at the beginning and a little bit longer at the end. And people just wanted me to walk around with my phone live streaming, because even if nothing was happening, they just didn't feel like they were getting an accurate view of what was going on in Ottawa. So that was, I think, it was a really illuminating experience for me of just how distrustful people outside of this part of Ottawa were of the coverage of the region.
What do you think the biggest thing that the most coverage about the convoy missed? What do you think the biggest missing piece was?
The largest thing is a bit more esoteric, but I think it's the question of who the people were and what they were and what they wanted. And part of the challenge there is that the convoy organizers made a decision early on, and I think it was a wrong decision. And a couple of them have said to me they thought it was a wrong decision as well, to exclude mainstream media from their press conferences and media availability. So the mainstream, I mean, there was one video of like Glenn McGregor in the hallway demanding to get into a room where they were having a press conference, and eventually the hotel just asked him to leave. And, you know, a lot of convoy supporters were like, ha, 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 mainstream media reporter kicked out a hotel. But the reality is then the media is gonna run with the story anyway, and they're left with that perspective that the convoy people felt was missing from government and the media. So that's a little bit of the why. And bias, I think, explains a little bit of the why as well. But go ahead.
Sorry, 'cause I just want to know, like, why did the convoy leadership refuse that? Why did they not want to give interviews with most media? And I know you say that it has contributed, but what are they to sort of a single narrative that didn't capture a lot about who these people really were and what they wanted? But do the people involved appreciate that now?
It's mixed. I mean, Benjamin Dichter, who was the lead spokesperson, for lack of a better term, he had said to me when I interviewed him, and the quotes in the book, that he really wanted to expose the media, that he knew the media would get things wrong, would take things out of context, and he really wanted to put that up on a pedestal, he said, and show off just how hostile they were. And that was, I think, a big thing we saw. Whenever the media did get something wrong, the convoy people were saying, ha ha, see, this is why we don't trust them. And I think there's some justification for that. I mean, when we saw CBC talking about whether the convoy was a creation of Russian actors, and when we saw predictions of violence that didn't materialize, there was an easy leap for these people to say, yeah, I don't think it's possible to get a fair shake from these folks. So if I don't agree, I still understand it. But it's also one of these things where they didn't have the benefit of weeks to come up with a strategy on this. They assembled this whole thing in less than 3 weeks. But I mean, media strategy really was not a thing. They had to just go, and this whole thing lasted no more than 4 weeks from the time it left for Ottawa to the time the Emergencies Act came in and then police cleared it. And that was, I think, in a lot of cases what we saw. They were kind of making things up as they went along because they had to.
And do you think that the people involved were sort of surprised by what happened? Because I mean, from the original reporting, is, as I said, a lot of the media was saying this is going to be nothing. Do you think that the people involved were surprised how long it lasted and how many people were involved and the level of engagement that this got?
Yes and no. I mean, certainly the financial aspect, they were very surprised by. Tamara Leach, when she started the GoFundMe, the initial fundraising campaign, her plan was maybe we raise $20,000 to buy some truckers some sandwiches. Like, she thought that if they got to 20, and then when Chris Barber said, no, set it at 100, she's like, you're crazy. You're out. Like, there's no way we're going to get 100,000. And then they ended up getting 10 million twice. So I think in that sense, it certainly did a lot to disrupt what they expected. But I also think on that journey to Ottawa, when they saw the overpasses, when they saw the shoulders, when they saw the flags, when they saw the social media numbers, which were just astronomical, they started to see this is going to be big. And I think at that point, by the time they got to Ottawa, they knew, okay, this was it. And they had always been. I mean, when police said we had no idea how long they were going to stand around in Ottawa, I was like, well, you should have been paying closer attention, because I went back even in the book, and they were very transparent, even before they got to Ottawa, that they're going to be there as long as it takes. And, you know, that first weekend, they held a press conference, and I or someone else, I can't remember, had asked Benjamin Dichter, how long are you going to be here? He said, well, you know, we've got, at that time, like, you know, $10 million, that buys a lot of fuel. And, you know, once the weather gets warmer, like, so they were remarkably transparent about preparing to be there for weeks and months.
Let's talk about the money, because I was also surprised by how much money they raised. It was a huge amount of money. So that money was first donated through GoFundMe. What happened to the GoFundMe money? And then what information is there about where that money was supposed to go?
So the money was supposed to cover initially the journey itself, because at the time they didn't know it was going to raise so much money. And GoFundMe has its own due diligence. They want to make sure that the money is going to someone who's lawfully able to receive it, and that it's going towards what donors were told it was going to. So they were asking a bunch of questions, which convoy organizers were sending. And they had actually assembled a finance committee, and they brought an accountant in to deal with this when they realized it was getting quite large. And GoFundMe initially released $1 million, and that was basically to cover fuel, which truckers had to front out of their own pockets for the initial part of the journey. And this was received, but what got very weird is that Tamara Leach had pulled $36,000, I think was the amount, out of her account. And this account had also received some direct donations through e-transfers. And then TD froze it as
This
part
is her
of its
personal account.
It was it wasn't the one she used, but it was an account in her name personally that she had set up for this, not a corporate account. And TD froze it under its like fraud prevention efforts. They say, well, we want to see where all these e-transfers are coming
And this
from.
was before the Emergencies Act was invoked.
Yes, before the Emergencies Act, and also before the injunction that the Ontario government got in a superior court. So of the GoFundMe money, organizers only got 36,000 out, and that went to gas and some like incidental expenditures. So then you fast forward a little bit, and GoFundMe has said, we believe this is now supporting an illegal occupation. It violates our terms of service. We're ending the account. We're ending the campaign. And this, we learned after, had been the result of lobbying by law enforcement and government. Certainly the city of Ottawa. We don't know how involved federal or provincial governments were. And initially, GoFundMe said you can ask to have a refund. And then there was such backlash. GoFundMe said, okay, never mind. We're automatically refunding the remaining, $9.5 million. So another campaign was started on an American platform called Give, Send, Go, which raised the exact same amount in days, in a fraction of the time. And then what happened is the Ontario government went to court and in secret and got an injunction to basically freeze that money and make it illegal to, I forget the exact term, but it was, to transfer, handle, possess, to do anything with that money. So they effectively froze anyone accessing the Give, Send, Go money, which was in an American account and hadn't been transferred into Canada and now couldn't be without being seized. So that was when a lot of people started to pivot to just giving cash, just sending direct e-transfers, bringing cash to Ottawa, sending goods instead of making them buy goods. Like there was one story of someone donating 20,000 hot dogs just because they didn't think that the truckers will be able to buy them themselves because they couldn't get donations. And ironically, because of all the freezing of the accounts and the ending campaigns, no one could actually tell how much money was passing through.
So let's talk about getting towards the end of the convoy. We've only got 10 minutes left. If any of our donors who watch this want to support longer form interviews, I could sure use Zoom Professional. So you make a donation at the ccf.ca to help me upgrade my Zoom.
Your accounts won't get frozen.
Your accounts would not get frozen. No, we get asked that a lot. So let's talk about the end. So there's actually been reporting since your book, front page of the Globe and Mail, front page of the Star. These were documents that we obtained through our litigation challenging the federal government's use of the Emergencies Act, that says that the cabinet and the incident response group were informed of a potential breakthrough in clearing the protest. And you've also written in your book about times when the convoy, some of the convoy leaders were trying to work with police to clear certain areas of the city, in particular Sussex Street, which is just to the east of Parliament, for those of you who don't know. So what happened there? And why did some parts of the convoy organizers want to work with city and police to move the vehicles?
Tom Marazzo, who I mentioned earlier, he actually had a very interesting story. He had a child who had dealt with a lot of illness in their life, and he was very, very passionate about keeping emergency lanes open. Like that was his obsession. Like he wanted to make sure that there was always an emergency lane open so that they could get by, they could rearrange vehicles, and police or ambulances or fire could get through if they needed to. So if ever there was an obstruction, he'd be right on it, and he had like a big map, and he was like moving things around it. So Tom Marazzo ended up becoming very instrumental in representing the convoy in discussions with police, especially when it came to these sorts of lanes. And at a certain point, he actually was invited to a meeting at City Hall, which also involved the lead counsel for the convoy, Keith Wilson, who was representing another legal charity, the JCCF. And they ended up having these talks, and Doug Ford's former chief of staff also got involved, Dean French, because he had a good relationship with the city of Ottawa's mayor, Jim Watson, and also was a supporter of what the convoy was trying to do. And he wanted to really get in there and de-escalate. So it was certainly ripe for negotiation, because Jim Watson's view was that, okay, I've got Ottawa residents, I've got constituents that are affected by this. They don't like trucks on their streets. The convoy organizers agreed with that. They said, yeah, we didn't come here to protest the city of Ottawa. We came here to protest the federal government. The only reason we're on all these residential streets is because there's no room for us downtown. So the deal that they reached behind closed doors was that all of the trucks would move on to Wellington Street, which there's no business on, there's no residential address on, it's just government buildings. And everyone that couldn't fit on Wellington Street would get out of Ottawa, where they had these other sort of encampments set up on private property or at truck stops and stuff like that. And they had agreed to this. And it was a 3-day operation, a 3-day plan to move this. And it was on the second day of that 3-day plan that the Emergencies Act came into effect. And that was, I think, the real challenge here, is that when you look at the stories that have come out since, which I think vindicate what's in my book, it's clear that the window to justify the Emergencies Act was closing fast, and even a day later would have been an impossible sell.
I mean, I don't think that window was ever open at all. I think the criteria under the Emergencies Act.
But politically, to justify it to people in a political way, which Trudeau wanted to do, would have been impossible a day later.
Yeah, I mean, it was always political, but I still don't buy the political explanation for it. Now let's talk about how things changed when the Emergencies Act was invoked. Was there a shift among the protesters? Was there a shift among the police? What can you tell me about that?
So police had generally been, I don't want to say supportive. I think on an individual level, police had very positive run-ins. I mean, there were police officers that there were videos of that were, high-fiving convoy people. And is that because they're supportive, or is it just because they're trying to avoid tension? I won't speculate. But police very much understood that, okay, this dynamic is going to change for us. I think in the broader public, it was interesting because some people were turning on the convoy the longer it went on, and especially with border blockades, which were not being choreographed by the people in Ottawa, but certainly were part of a broader movement. And the public, I think, was turning. When the Emergencies Act came in, I think any moral high ground that the federal government had was lost. I mean, even Paul Champ, who's the lawyer that fought the injunction against the convoy, he spoke up and said, yeah, I'm not a fan of this Emergencies Act thing at all. And groups like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, like yours, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, speaking up and saying, whoa, we've got like grave concerns with this. So I think the government overplayed its hand dramatically. And I think people started to see that. For the people in the convoy, I think a lot of them were in disbelief, because they were there advocating for freedom. And that means different things to different people. But the most antithetical thing to freedom then came out, which is just these incredibly emergency anti-civil liberty powers from the government. And a lot of them were truly, truly baffled by that.
So we've only got about 4 minutes left. So why don't you tell me about the end of the protest? You were there for when it was cleared. What did you see? And there's a crazy incident about what happened to you. You ended up being pepper sprayed yourself while they were reporting. So why don't you tell us that story, how it ended?
Yeah, what I saw actually was nothing for a brief period of time when I lost the ability to see. So it moved very slowly at first. So I was actually there for what ended up being the last few days of this thing. And on the Friday morning, the movement was slowly taking place. And police were moving forward in a formation like, maybe 6 to 8 feet every 10 to 15 minutes. And by the afternoon, they had wrapped around that critical intersection of Rideau and Sussex, and they were moving west towards Parliament Hill. And they had started going a lot more quickly. And there's that famous photo that people have seen of this Indigenous woman, Candace Sarah, who's on the ground with her walker aside when police horses had moved in, and the video of that. And I was right in front of the Chateau Laurier Hotel at the time that happened. And what people didn't see was that off to the side, police broke their formation. And I'm convinced it was not intentional. I'm convinced that something went wrong there because it ended up pushing people to the side, and I was ended up at a time like kind of pinned up against a wall and not able to get out of Dodge. And I was where other journalists were and other photographers that were capturing this. I wasn't on the front lines with a picket sign or anything. And what ended up happening, I was trying to move back and move out of the way safely. And at a certain point, I just felt, first off, moisture on my face. And then a split second later, everything just started burning and my eye sort of seized up. And, being a millennial journalist, the first thing I did is took a selfie and tweeted about it. Part of that was because I wanted to basically capture the exact moment, because I knew that this would really come down to a minute by minute understanding of what happened. And that's ended up being helpful since. But other people as well had this. I mean, there was another journalist who had a tear gas canister shot at her leg, which had tremendous velocity. There was the woman that was knocked over. There were other people as well that were pepper sprayed. There was an American journalist that was thrown to the ground and zip tied before eventually being released. And then the next day, after the streets had been cleared, people that were threatened with arrest for walking down the street when Trudeau had looked Canadians in the face and said, "Your civil liberties remain intact."
So disturbing. Well, you cover it all in your book, which people can sign up to win a free copy of at the ccf.ca/book contest. But if they don't win, how do they buy it, Andrew?
Well, you can go to Amazon. You can go to Indigo's website, but don't go into an Indigo store and look around because for whatever reason, they don't want to put it on their shelves. And the publisher of the book, Sutherland House, has it available on their website as well, which is sutherlandhousebooks.com.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, thanks so much for writing this. I loved it. I think that the viewers of my channel are going to love it as well. So thanks for coming on, talking to us today about everything you saw and everything you wrote about. I always love talking to you. I go on your show all the time, so it's nice to have you on mine for a change.
It was great. Thanks so much, Christine.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Have a great night.